semifinals of this year's Intertext Novice WSDC. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far. My name is Paolo. I'm going to be your chair for today. My pronouns are he or they, although I prefer if you refer to me or anyone in the panel as just simply the panel. I have two panelists with me who wish to introduce themselves, starting with Martin.
Yeah, hello, my name is Martin. All the best to you guys.
Hi, I'm Xandy. Congrats on making it to this round and have a great round.
Okay, so on proposition bench, we have 3 Musketeers, and on the opposition bench, we have gassy dookie crew. Debating on emotion, this house prefers a world where relationships were considered primarily transactional rather than being intrinsically fulfilling. Let's kick off this debate, starting with the Prime Minister whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you check that I'm audible, please?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. Just let me set up my timer real quick. I go by she, her pronouns, and I prefer verbal PRIs, please. Imagine this. You spend your whole life loving someone. You put them as a first priority above your own health and safety. You always make time for them. You always pay attention to them. You never miss a single anniversary or their birthday celebrations. Only on your deathbed do you realize that you have wasted your life stuck in a toxic, manipulative relationship, loving the wrong person, wasting your life away. We want to prevent this from happening. So proud to propose. Before I move on to my substantive, a few points of clarification for the House. First, on relationship. We think traditionally it is fair for us to define relationship as romantic relationship because it is the first thing that comes to people's mind when we hear about the word. I.e., if I say I'm in a relationship with someone, it's most likely a romantic relationship. Also, the word intrinsically fulfilling also suggests that it's a romantic relationship because they themselves, they alone, occupy such an important weight and emotional value in our heart, right? Notice that in such relationships, there is already existing social contract between two people. It is pre-established trust, and people already have expectations in place. Second point then, on inherent emotional desire for reciprocation. Note that humans have this inherent human nature for their efforts to be met with equivalent amount of effort. This is extremely unrealistic for them to expect nothing. They want the feeling of being cared for, cherished, and valued. It is a fundamental human feeling in close relationships. For example, relationships thrive on expressions of love through words, gestures, shared experiences, the feeling of being supported by someone emotionally, the assurance that someone will be there during challenging times to listen with you, listen to you, empathize with you, to provide comfort, so on and so forth. It is unfair for opposition if they ever come up and say that it is intrinsically fulfilling to expect nothing. Third point then on transactional. We think it means we expect both partners to reciprocate emotionally, i.e. if one partner prioritizes the other person at a very high level, we think it is fair for them to expect the same level in return. We do not want them to feel as if their efforts are not met, that they're chasing behind the wrong person, which will lead to bitter resentment and pent-up emotions. Fourth point on intrinsically fulfilling. We think it simply means not holding a partner accountable for making you happy. Instead, you yourself assign fulfillment to relationship and you are independently happy without this external validation. It is okay if they do not love me as much because I find happiness in itself loving them. But before I move on, yes.
Would you choose to not date someone because there's a potential of them breaking up with you?
I don't think this is what I've been trying to say, but I would definitely not date someone if from the very get-go, after I communicate what my expectations are, they show the negligence or the unawareness or the unwillingness to put in as much effort. If then, yes. And our society is a society that pushes for the model that encourage people to step out of this unfulfilled relationships, right? Which I will get to in my substantive. Fifth point on status quo. We see that most people already need reciprocation because one, human nature, as I've explained to you, and two, it is simply too emotionally draining to put your partner above your job, above your health, above everything else, only for that to be poorly received, not up to par or acknowledged by the other person. If opposition wants to claim that relationship can be intrinsically fulfilled, you. You do not need a relationship in the first place. You can just admire them from afar and get happiness. Because the word relationship is involved, we think it is extremely fair for both parties to expect something in return, and it is not selfish at all. Moving on to my substantive then, on why it is better to form relationship having this expectations from the very get-go. From the very start, I want to make it clear that for givers, it will be extremely easy for them to vocalize their expectations, for them to know their boundaries, know what they need. For example, if I am a person who needs very high attention or who needs quality time, I will feel comfortable telling my partner that, hey, I will need this quality time from you. I expect this from you. And in return, I will give you this. We think it's perfectly okay because now your partner knows. And it's from the very get-go, it is already better because the chances of you forming healthy relationship is so much higher. You're now taking accountability for your happiness, which in no way is selfish, right? And on the receiving end, now my partner becomes so much more aware that, hey, in order to be in a relationship in the first place, I have to put in this effort. Even when we acknowledge that perhaps majority of people are not toxic in the first place, they are now at least aware and no longer negligent. They understand that relationship is a two-way thing. There's a give and take, and they will not be pushing so much pressure on one party alone. Moving on to how opposition ruins relationship as a whole, right? On the receiver's end, for them, the expectations are not clearly communicated because human emotions in themselves is not shared, right? If you do not communicate clearly, no one can guess what you're thinking about. And because of the model society pushes, it is extremely difficult for those on the receiver end to detect that they are stuck in a toxic relationship in the first place because the partner can simply disguise it as something that is normal and push them for being selfish. Their partner will not take them seriously when they actually find the courage to vocalize. But above that, I think it is very important for us to note that you yourself will be pressurized not to communicate in the first place because society says that you shouldn't expect your partner to give back. When you demand accountability, you will be labeled as the outlier, the outcast, as someone who is so selfish in the wrong for asking for way too much and putting yourself first. And even for toxic partners, we see that there is a spectrum, right? On one end, you have the abusers, be it physical abuse, verbal abuse, or those who are emotionally manipulative. And we see that for people stuck in these relationships, it is much harder for them to communicate their needs and what they actually want from their partner, or even to get out of this toxic relationship if they can't stand it. What we see as a result is that they spend their whole life with the wrong person, only to realize that it is extremely toxic, but there is no way for them to get out. And it's like, as already explained, it is much harder for them to identify in the first place. But on the other end of the spectrum, which is the majority cases, partners in opposition's world are so much more negligent about the wants and the needs and the desires of their partners. Now, they're unaware that they're suffering from it until there is one trigger point, for example, a major crisis, a family event, or maybe things like breakup, when they suddenly realize all the pent-up emotions through the years, and they feel this overwhelming power of guilt. We see that such pent-up emotions is extremely harmful for both the party delivering love on the receiving end and for the party on the giving end. We also see that if opposition ever comes up here and tell you that, hey, it is enough for you to love your partner alone and it in itself will bring you fulfillment, we see it is extremely short-term in nature because sooner or later there will be an event that will question the foundation of the relationship if the basis is not strong enough, right? It is an extremely short-termist point of view and there will be a trigger point in future. And also note that majority of people, like I've established before, would want something out of relationship. Now, because of the model that opposition's world pushes for, most of the people cannot vocalize their needs, and by sheer magnitude, we win. On how we are much more likely to get into healthy relationship in outside of the world than on our side, because we have healthy communication, the partners are much more likely to work through the problems instead of running away from them or burying them, right? Opposition pushes for a world of unrequited love, where the other end of the relationship is not considered, and it is extremely hard for you to get out of toxic relationship. We at least have understanding. We prevent emotional abuse and negligence. We prevent pent-up emotions being unleashed as this rage and guilt on the other end. We prevent people spending their life loving the wrong person and wasting their love and potential on the wrong recipient. Because we protect people's interests and form healthy relationships, so proud to propose.
Okay, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Reminder for all speakers to please double check if you are muted or not on Zoom because we do not want to interrupt other speakers as well. Moving on to the Leader of Opposition.
Hi, can I check that I'm visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Okay, give me a few seconds. Okay. Before I begin, POIs in the chat, just a very quick shout out to Kevin and supporters. Yeah. Right. Starting my speech, POIs in the chat if I didn't say that. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The concept of relationships and the concept of love is something that is intrinsically fulfilling. It is something that human beings cannot describe the feeling of being loved and being in a relationship. It is so abstract that this government team cannot come up and say that doing this will create a better relationship without actually explaining how relationship dynamics work. The first thing I will do is to explain how government doesn't understand the concept of a relationship. The first thing that the Prime Minister said that you don't want to love and then find out that the person didn't love you back. The first response is that you don't choose to love because they might break up with you. This was mentioned in the POI, and things like narratives of how it's better to have love than to not have love at all because you are willing to sacrifice for your partner even though a breakup is possible. On the government world, this would mean that people don't get into relationships because there's a risk of breaking up. But things like parents having children even though they might possibly not give back to them, or how parents always do things for the kid, even though they know it's expensive and even though they know the kid cannot reciprocate at that instant. The second response is that effort does not equal to love. Obviously, if you want to put in effort to win something, you don't always expect something back. But secondly, it also means that even if you put effort, there is no definite benefit for you to get back anyway. But secondly, even if you communicate your love, they might not love you back because we don't have to defend things like unrequited love in the chat because it's basic human decency to not be an asshole. But thirdly, vocalizing boundaries as a opt-out mechanism is shallow and lying is possible. The first reason why this is true is because your partner has no epistemic access to your needs and desires, which means to say that even if you vocalize your needs, they might not fully understand you. But secondly, your partner can also lie because they might say that they love you now and they might do these things in the relationship, but that might not be true. But thirdly, explanation is tiring. Obviously, we agree that communication is good between partners, but if you have to say everything that you want the moment that you meet this person or every conversation that you have, it is tiring for both you and your partner. But lastly, this is also a shallow relationship that is created the moment you say that you want this to happen. The first thing I will do in the speech is talk about what intrinsically fulfilling means. Obviously, it means genuinely meaningful relationships. I want to put a caveat that this motion is about how people view relationships and not how not about how a relationship actually is, because the motion wording says that people will consider the relationship to be primarily transactional. The likely opposition argument is that relationships are transactional in nature. Obviously, we do agree with this, but people tend to not want to think about it as transactional. Things that are usually transactional in relationships could be like giving and receiving loves in relationship, providing gifts for your partner, being attractive for your partner, doing things that your partner likes. All of these things are things that people know that they have to do in order to stay in a relationship, but subconsciously they want to pretend that they don't know, right? But intrinsically fulfilling also means that it's some higher order satisfaction that you cannot get from something else, because you can't get the same satisfaction like you get from buying a gift or saying I love you. The comparative is that you find meaning in things like raising your kid and starting a family and caring for your old parents. The second thing I'm going to do is how people view relationships now on the comparative and how it affects the relationship dynamic. The premise of this argument is that people will interact with others in a relationship differently. The first reason as to why this is true is because of the expectation in a relationship. The moment that you say that the relationship is primarily transactional and you that you have to do this, like you have to do 1 for you to get 2, like a math output. Your relationship now feels like a contract. The first thing that you do when you meet someone is to say like what you want, and you ought to love your partner this way, you ought to love me this way in order for me to provide you this benefit back. All of this means that you are constantly paranoid about things like, are you doing well enough? Are you doing enough for your partner? Are you giving enough? Am I pretty enough for my partner to continue loving me back? This paranoia within a relationship continues to form relationships that are toxic and relationships that are shallow. This is bad because instead of focusing on the actual relationship and the love itself and what happens within, you are worried on whether or not you will actually have a relationship in the future. You treat this relationship like an investment because you always expect something in return, or you always expect something that your partner can give you. The second reason why this is true is now that family dynamics are messed up, because like look at Asian communities, which is the closest to like a transactional relationship, right? Because your parents raise you like an insurance policy, i.e. you can grow up and take care of them when they are older. These are transactional traits of a relationship that people genuinely don't like anyway, which means to say that on the comparative, you never worry about parents hurting you or hating you because they are expected to unconditionally love you whether or not you do well in school or whether or not you do well in life. The weighing here is that 1, there's an extremely high expectation put you on the relationship as like regardless of whether or not you are in a romantic one or with your family and whatnot. But 2, the meaning that you get from close relationships are now messed up. This is bad because 1, this expectation sours our relationship. Their idea of a perfect relationship doesn't exist because this constant expectation on whether or not you can meet every single criteria within the relationship does not exist on their side, because a person is genuinely flawed in nature and they cannot cater to everything that another person wants. This is also true because people in relationships tend to try and craft their partners in a way that is the most favorable for them. But this doesn't happen because everybody is unique. But secondly, there's also an innate desire for companionship and love, and this is not satisfied on the comparative because you feel sad and you feel lonely and you just feel used because you are in a transactional relationship. Before moving on to impacts POI.
So you think it's wrong for people to take responsibility for their own happiness and to set their own boundaries then?
That's not the point of the debate. The thing about it is that if you perceive a relationship to be transactional, obviously this sours relationships. Most people don't go into a relationship by saying that, hey, I want you to kiss me every single night. I want you to come to my house every single day and every single week. All of these things don't create accountability because 1, the opt-out mechanism from your partner is just to lie to you because people are fake in nature. But secondly, this also means that like things like having a genuine relationship where people actually care about you doesn't exist, and all of these things are extremely shallow in nature. The impact onto individuals then is the direct clash towards this government team. This government team thinks that when you state your relationship boundaries and you state your desires and requirements, it means that you will get a good relationship because you are now accountable for your relationship. All of these things do not happen because if you want to remain accountable to your relationship, you are going to be continuously tired because you have to like continuously express relationships for one another. This is the reason why people choose to settle with like poorer relationships because they think that they shouldn't communicate because it is tiring for them. All of this means that 1, transactional love is extremely tiring. Presumably, you have to tell your partner what you want and how they can repay you. You constantly need to express your needs and your boundaries, and all of this is bad in a way because 1, communication is tiring and that defeats the point of love. The reason as to why this is true, that the harm is larger on government, is because of the perception that transactionality influences people to do something, to desire something for their partner. But 2, people just want to be loved unconditionally. It is not true that every single moment you have to tell your partner what you want, because the human brain is wired in a way that forces you to want to be with someone, to be able to turn off your brain when you're beside someone. It is also tiring on the comparative that you constantly tell people about what you want. You never emotionally feel that your partner knows what you want because you have to verbally say it. But 2, it also requires a high level of emotional maturity from your partner to understand what you want. But lastly, basic relationships like friendships are harder to form because the reason as to why friendships are desirable now is because of things like mutual understanding. You don't cut off your friend because they're assholes or because they were racist for one moment. You don't hold grudges or a checklist to determine whether or not your friend is the best. Like, are you racist? Are you homophobic? This makes extremely toxic relationships. But secondly, you will never leave your friends because you always have their backs. Your friends will always love you. Things like brotherhood always exist because you know that your friends will always continue texting you and always coming to care for you. But the last thing is that why it's good is a higher order form of relationship. Human psychology gives you the innate desire for companionship. It's very hard for you to get this anywhere else. This is literally the meaning for you to be a human. If you were to have a relationship that is transactional, you're unable to get a happier relationship because you feel like the person doesn't understand you.
All right, we thank the leader of opposition for that speech. Moving on to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, just give me a moment to set up my timer. Okay, sorry. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Relationships are about compromise and are symbiotic in nature. Not just you, but your partner needs to commit on the same level. And this sort of equivalent exchange needs to happen, or else the incumbent party, which pours their heart and soul out, gets hurt deeply and irreversibly. And insofar as these two criteria of compromise, of how the relationships are symbiotic in nature, are not fulfilled, i.e. one side gives less of a priority or gives less of a commitment to the other party, what you probably get is relationships which are one-sided, superficial, or at worst, toxic in nature. So pride to propose. So just some points that side opposition came up. The first thing they come and talk to us is that like communication is tiring or bad, and that you should be able to give love unconditionally without expecting anything in return. We don't see why this is necessarily true. Again, I've already stated, right, relationships is about communication. If you don't communicate with your significant other, it is not a relationship. It is just a one-way communication channel. So therefore, we don't necessarily see communication in and of itself being bad. But we also think that it is sort of better to state boundaries, right? My first speaker has already stated that people expect things in a relationship, whether implicitly or explicitly, and we think that it is okay. This sort of expectation stems from an inherent need for companionship. Again, my first speaker already stated that, right? But then again, you don't want to be treated like crap, right? Like in your relationship. Understand also that it is really, really emotionally draining to be in a one-sided relationship. And insofar as you're entering a social contract, insofar as you're entering a relationship, it is okay to be accountable, and we think that it is absurd to say otherwise. Then they come and talk to us about how if your friends are being toxic, if your friends treat you like crap, if your friends, for instance, are blatantly racist towards your own minority group, that it is okay for you to stay with them. We think that this is completely untrue. Even 1 or 2 instances probably is enough to leave a bad taste in your mouth, right? The fact that they can utter those words to someone which presumably is very, very close to them probably means that they are willing to continue this behavior in the future, and that it is okay to separate yourselves from them. Okay, so then they come and talk to us about how, telling your significant other about what you want in a relationship is very, very committal, and that people are imperfect, so each criteria can be met. I already responded to this by saying that relationships are about compromise, relationships are symbiotic in nature, so therefore we don't necessarily think that this point stands at all, right? Understand also that this sort of satisfaction intangibly isn't mutually exclusive to sort of your narrative of intrinsic satisfaction, right? Understand that the example they gave about how parents don't expect, not expecting children to give them back things like money, give them back things like, reparations for when the parent brought the child up. Probably, okay, yeah, it is true, right? But parents also get this sort of payback in the form of seeing their child being nurtured, seeing their child being cared for, seeing their child grow up to be the mini version of themselves that they so desire. And that is why parents are parents, or parents become parents in the first place, right? So that is sort of the transaction that you make. Okay, then the last point on basic human decency being a guarantee, and so toxic relationships not being a thing. This isn't true at all, right? A lot of people in society are selfish. A lot of people in society may not necessarily be selfish, but they may be short-sighted. They may not be able to have the emotional intelligence to sort of have the foresight to see their significant other. And so therefore, we think that then setting boundaries, communicating with your partner about things like your issues, about things like what you expect in a relationship is justified. So then on to my substantive of how the narrative of relationships being intrinsically fulfilling instead of transactional probably harms relationships at both levels. But before I get into that, I'll take a point.
How often do you see someone getting into a relationship with someone that doesn't love them?
Okay, understand that relationships are long-termist in nature, right? So like in the short term, yes, you may get like this of hedonistic, like hedonistic feeling that, okay, I have entered a relationship with someone, I am worthy, and so therefore, like, and so therefore I love them. But understand that in the long term, when you sort of have things like marriage, when you have sort of things like you entering a long-term societal contract, what probably happens is that you, apart from just like basic happiness, which is short-term, you also need the long-term in terms of things like joy, in terms of things like commitment, etc. And so therefore, we necessarily see that in society, again, like there are a lot of people entering relationships where your significant other either A, doesn't love you at all, or B, lacks the foresight to see that they are unable to love you in the long term. Okay, so then onto my substantives, right? So I'll be differentiating this into two layers. The first layer is on the relationships that are just starting. Understand that when you have a society that runs the narrative of transactional, the nature of relationship being transactional, what you probably get is that the receiver is the giver of love probably is more likely to know the boundaries, more likely to explore the boundaries, and is generally more likely to be vocal in terms of how they express their needs, their wants, etc. Right. And furthermore, we also see that you sort of pressure the other side to respond in kind, to reciprocate this like sort of love that the giver of love is giving. Right. So this sort of removes the chance of negligence, either negligence or lack of foresight, that maybe in the long term they are unable to love each other. Right. So generally you get better outcomes in terms of people entering relationships. But what about relationships in the long term, right? Side opposition necessarily enables toxic actors for these long-term relationships, right? Because you sort of set the precedent and you set this narrative, or you set this belief that for the person who is giving love, even if they feel that love is not being returned in kind, you can't necessarily vocalize this, right? Furthermore, because of the societal narrative, we probably have things like it being really, really difficult to detect abuse for a couple of reasons. The first is the fact that like with this narrative, with the fact that you having unconditional love is okay even if the other side is unwilling to respond in kind, what you probably get is things like emotional manipulation, right? But what makes it harder to detect abuse is the fact that you are going against a societal narrative, which is really, really important, right? You set this precedent that if you don't love your partner without a prerequisite, if you don't love your partner, and they don't love you back, you are a bad actor, and you shouldn't expect your partner to give you things in return for you loving them. And so therefore on an individual level, you sort of perceive this as this really, really unjustified narrative as justified because of the fact that it's a societal narrative, right? Because of the fact that things like rhetoric, which says that, okay, if you don't love your partner without a prerequisite, you're a bad actor, right? Furthermore, we think that a societal narrative is accepted by the majority of society, so therefore you're more likely to buy into it. Things like, you in your formative years growing up as a teenager, having the idea of intrinsic fulfilling relationships being the right one, being that, you shouldn't enter a relationship with any prerequisite whatsoever, which is completely true, both on a human nature level and both on an emotional level. And so therefore, we think that the necessary outcomes is that A, your partner won't listen to you as much, right? I.e., the sort of receiver of emotion can't necessarily internalize and understand insofar as society sets this narrative of you not necessarily having to have a prerequisite to love someone. Probably means that the partner not only is unable to internalize this, it also probably means that they see you as things like selfish, see you as things like uncompromising. And so therefore you sort of create this barrier between you, the receiver, as well as the giver of love, which probably means that in the long term, relationships have a worse outcome, which probably means that you enable toxic actors for long-term relationships. As such, this side proposition, the side that protects relationships, the side that protects emotion.
Okay, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Moving on to the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hi. Just to confirm, I am visible and audible.
Yes to both.
Give me a second. POIs verbally, please. Before I start my speech, just a shout out to Sigma Boys and
Haven. Okay. Yes. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So now, first I'm going to take down their entire point on like one-sided relationships, which is that I think that if like you are genuinely happy in a one-sided relationship, that you are genuinely feeling fulfillment within the relationship itself, even if the relationship is one-sided, even if the other person like doesn't really care about you but is in a relationship with you for some reason, that I think that is good. I think it's good that you are happy in this relationship. That I think that it doesn't really matter whether or not the other person is reciprocating or not. If you are genuinely happy, if you are genuinely enjoying your time in the relationship, if you genuinely love the other person. Now on to the point on toxic relationships. So they say that like toxic relationships won't happen because people like talk about boundaries, and this also, and this my analysis is also going to take down the entire like thing about how like there's going to be more communication, because my first speaker has already talked about how like people who enter relationships like don't necessarily like they don't have epistemic access to like your entire life, so they don't actually understand, it's impossible for them to fully understand like the other person in order to communicate that. And on top of that, people who enter into relationships, like simply put, like in the majority of times, like you don't actually know what's going to happen in a relationship, because like you don't know, like it's not like they are like on their world they're gonna like meet the parents, they're gonna know like every single detail of their life, they're gonna know every single detail of like their parents' life, their siblings' lives, etc. And then see like, oh no thank you, and see like which one of those are like which one of those things are like exceeding the boundary. So I think that the things about communication are entirely symmetric. And yes, and on the thing about toxic relationships is that toxic relationships will happen on both sides, because what happens then is that on both sides there will be bad actors, and on both sides like these bad actors will find ways to manipulate you into thinking that you know like you should stay in a relationship or whatever. So on the government side, these bad actors will still like lie to you, will still actually cheat you, and will still actually like manipulate you to stay in the relationship, such that like when like from your perspective like the relationship is like you are giving enough to the other person about the relationship, and that like the relationship is good, like it fulfills like the transactional needs that they claim. So at this point in my speech, you should believe that like in general the proposition team doesn't really have many benefits. So there are benefits about like one-sided relationships. I think we've sufficiently covered that, as well as like there are benefits on toxic relationships. We've already dealt with that, as well as I've already explained why communication is going to be symmetrical. Before I move on to my positive material of PI.
Regarding your rebuttal on communication, I think it's significantly better for when you actually state the specific wants and the expectations of your partner from the get-go, and I think that leads to less conflict overall.
Again, okay, my first speaker as well as myself have already explained why that is simply not possible, because like you don't know everything about your partner, you don't know everything about the situation your partner is in, you don't know every situation that you're gonna be in like in a relationship. You like most likely like individuals don't actually know much about themselves and how they behave in relationships as well, until they actually get into the relationship, until they actually like get into the situations in which like they actually start like behaving in that way. And that means that the communication just doesn't make sense, and it's completely symmetrical in that way, in that sense, where like both individuals on both boats like won't know these things until they actually like enter the relationship in the first place. So now moving on to my positive material. So I'm going to so my first speaker has already talked about why this generally like makes relationships better, or why our side makes relationships better, and what the proposition sides like makes like the relationships in proposition are going to be a lot more shallow, and a lot more shallow. Now I'm going to talk about like how the proposition like narrative like impacts disproportionately impacts women, because like within a relationship itself, like historically women have been seen as like people who are expected to sacrifice for the relationship, people who are expected to like give away more from the relationship. So in the government's world, what happens then is that these women are like this narrative that exists that women are supposed to sacrifice, like this like these women going into relationships, like they have the expectation that they have to sacrifice because like the relationship is transactional. Like, oh, you know, my husband won't love me if I don't like if I don't give him sexual favors, you know, things like that. And what this looks like is that like the narrative looks like how women are expected to quit their jobs to become housewives in relationships. Like historically, women are expected to sacrifice by like completely like changing their lives for for pregnancy, and like even simple things like women being expected to actually like lose their last name in the marriage. So all of this like compound into the fact that like government side is inherently like supporting traditional like patriarchal norms, and this means that this strips away the agency from many women that enter into relationships because they go into those relationships thinking that like they are expected to fulfill a certain need, and this need usually like in the world, and this need looks like the like patriarchal needs that were defined in the past, and this means that women as a whole like lose a lot of agency within relationships. These women feel like they're like forced to give favors to their husbands. They're forced to actually like submit to their husbands like wants and needs, and all of these things is so terrible because like it has a widespread impact on women on how they view relationships and on how they feel within relationships as a whole. So now I'm going to move on to my other substantive, which is about how this also disproportionately affects disabled people. Because can you imagine being like someone who's wheelchair bound and having friends that like push you everywhere, that will with you, that stay with you, and then you think to yourself like, why are these friends actually doing these things for me, right? Like, why are these friends like hanging out with me, doing all these favors for me, like pushing like my wheelchair for me, instead of like hanging out with other friends who are like who are not in wheelchairs, who like don't need these kinds of like effort, who don't like need these kinds of favors. And what this means is that like these individuals, like these disabled people within relationships, for example, like friendships, and even for things like relationships with your parents, for example. This means that in this these disabled people within these relationships, there's a seed of doubt in their mind about whether or not they deserve to be in this relationship in the first place. They feel like they're not enough for the other person. They feel like, you know, they don't deserve to actually be friends with the other person because they aren't actually able to reciprocate like the amount of energy that they're given in terms of favors, in terms of actually pushing for example, like doing things like pushing the like wheelchairs. So this has a few impacts in which like disabled people generally have like worse relationships as a whole because they feel like they are guilty of like being in the relationship. They feel like they're stripping away like the friends. They're stripping away the friends, or like they're not worth the friends like friendship. Like they feel like these things isn't something that they actually deserve. As well as like they feel like the parents who like actually give them like favors, the parents that actually like nurture them from young. They feel like they aren't worth it basically in this in the relationships as a whole. So what this means is that like as a whole and on top of that, the last thing I would like to bring up is that how this affects government policy, which is like how in the government world, the policy will be impacted by how like people will view relationships as transactional, and this will coerce people into like getting married and into getting a child, and this is very, very terrible. And for all these reasons, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. Moving on to the Government Whip.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, great. Just give me a moment to set up my timer. Apologize, I don't have a camera, so I can't turn it on. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is not wrong for you to expect things of your partner. It's not wrong for you to take responsibility for your own happiness, and it's not wrong for you to want things in return for the amount of love and the amount of time that you're pouring into your significant other, never been brother to propose. There are two main points of contention for the House today. First, on this idea of paranoia and worry, and second, on this idea of emotional security. I'm going to first be dealing with this idea of paranoia and worry because I think this is one of the main pushes that comes out from the entirety of PsyOp. What do they tell us about paranoia and worry? They tell us a couple of things. First, they tell us that people will start treating relationships as investments on outside of the house, and then they explain to us that people will be paranoid about what your partner thinks of you, and that they will feel as though like they constantly need to give their partner love, if not their partner will leave them. A couple of things to this. First of all, this isn't mutually exclusive. The fact of the matter is that insecurity exists regardless of which model you necessarily subscribe to, right? Like you will always constantly be afraid that your partner will leave you in any given situation if you're an insecure individual. And if you're not in a secure relationship, that's not going to change regardless of which model you necessarily subscribe to. But we want to flip this actually. We tell you that when you actually have the expectations of your partner clearly laid out, it's less likely that you feel insecure so long as you are actually going to be able to fulfill it. Right? On your side of the house, when you have these self-fulfilling principles or when you don't have clear communication, people will still feel insecure, but they'll probably feel even more insecure insofar as they don't know what their partner wants from them. So we tell you regarding paranoia and worry, we flip this and we tell you it's significantly worse on your side of the house. But secondly, there's also a difference between recognizing that your partner expects things of you and being afraid that you can't fulfill those expectations. Because if you didn't feel confident in your ability to provide your partners with what you want, then you probably wouldn't get into the relationship in the first place. Therefore, then we tell you when it comes to a transactional relationship, it's likely that you understand the needs of your partners and only get into it in a situation in which you are secure. So this argument completely falls and this clash is a wash. But second clash on emotional security and the main argument, or rather the main clash in today's debate. So if we win this, we basically win today's debate as a whole. There are two main ways that this clash manifests throughout today's debate. First, in the realm of expectations, and second on this idea of toxic partners. So what do they tell us about expectations? This is their main push. First of all, before I get into this, I want to note that they cannot run away from defending things like unrequited love, because a lot of partners and a lot of people under their model who don't understand their own boundaries and who don't understand that they should expect things from their partners, they probably won't be able to actually identify what they want from a relationship. And therefore then a lot of them will probably get into relationships in which it is one-sided. So they cannot simply run away from this by saying, oh, you simply won't get into relationships in which is one-sided. You probably will when you believe that your partner reciprocating isn't something which is actually important, or the very least that you aren't able to vocalize that, right? So we tell you that they cannot run away from that. But secondly, we want to note that their argument regarding communication really doesn't make any sense. They try to claim that on our side of the house, you can't get perfect communication. Look, we never claim that we're going to be able to get perfect communication on outside of the house. We simply claim that we get more communication, which is inherently better for the relationship in the long term. Before I continue, PY. 3, 2, 1.
The extent of insecurity is not symmetric. If you have a checklist that you always have to fulfill for your partner to love you, you would feel more paranoid.
Okay, sure. Even if we want to give you the argument on paranoia, the fact of the matter is that on your side of the house, people still feel emotionally drained. But second of all, we also want to note the fact that the insecurity is going to be largely symmetrical, because as I've already told you, people always constantly feel as though their partner might leave them, and therefore there's still probably a level of paranoia on your side of the house. Moving back on to expectations, again, don't allow them to basically get away with this. The fact of the matter is that the communication is not a symmetric point. The fact of the matter is on their side of the house, they won't be able to get communication because people feel as though taking responsibility for their own happiness is an affront to what relationship should be about. But we don't believe that that's the case. We don't believe that relationship should be inherently about you giving and giving and giving and not getting anything in return. We tell you that that's something which is emotionally draining. Take note that they don't deal with any of the analysis that my first speaker gives you. They don't deal with the fact that we explain to you why people inherently want reciprocation, why people inherently feel really emotionally neglected when their partners don't reciprocate, right? They don't deal with this, and therefore we tell you, we already take this debate on this, but and in Oshi it's way too late to respond, right? Okay, then what's the second claim that they give us regarding expectations? They tell us that there's a greater degree of expectation placed on the individual, and therefore then they won't be happy. Look, we concede to this. We agree that you have a greater degree of expectation in a relationship when the relationship is inherently transactional. We don't agree with the fact that this is a bad thing. We are willing to trade off the fact that relationships are going to be more pressurizing on our side of the house if it means that we can create healthier relationships in which both partners are actually actively contributing to it and actually reciprocating the love that is being shown, right? We want to further mitigate this by also explaining the fact that you are going into it with the understanding of what your partner expects from you. So if you feel as though you aren't actually going to be able to fulfill those expectations, you probably just wouldn't go into the relationship in the first place. But thirdly, and this deals with the entire push that comes in second with the disabled people argument, obviously the level that we expect of others is not a fixed thing. The point about disabled people is countered by the fact that people are probably just expect less, right? They will probably account for the fact that these people are disabled and not expect the same level of reciprocation or the same level of commitment and whatnot. So obviously, we don't really understand how exactly this argument manifests to any capacity. But look, even if we want to be as charitable as possible and give them a point about expectations, we are again willing to trade this off because of the second point and the more important point in today's debate, negligent or toxic actors. Look, we give you a lot of analysis regarding toxic or negligent actors. We explain this in two ways. First of all, we explain how exactly it makes it so that individuals who are participating within a relationship are less able to vocalize their own personal problems in the relationship, right? Because when your overwhelming narrative that's being pushed to these people is that, look, relationships should be like unrequited. You should continuously give your love and you should not expect anything in return. That's when you get people afraid to vocalize their own needs. That's when you get people who are afraid to tell their partners that they're getting really emotionally frustrated by the fact that they don't feel love in return. We tell you that this isn't something which is healthy for these individuals because they will just constantly feel as though they are being emotionally neglected and abused by their partners. And even if they feel as though they need to actually get more emotion and more love from their partners, they are unable to vocalize it because of the societal narrative that opposition stands for. But secondly, on the topic on negligent actors, we tell you that negligent actors themselves are less able to actually change or less able to identify their own shortcomings. Because insofar as love is not seen as a two-way thing and is simply seen as something that you should give and give and give, then you as a negligent actor are also less likely to identify the fact that you are being negligent in the first place because you don't feel the need to give your partner love. That probably leads to far more problems for the relationship as a whole. At the end of the day, we tell you one thing very, very simply, that you need to communicate, and in order to communicate, people need to understand that relationships are transactional and that relationships are inherently a two-way thing, right? The upshot of this argument is very simple. In a world in which relationships are transactional, we get more open communication. We get people who are more able to do things like identify when their partners are being negligent of them, when people, they are going to be able to do things like identify when their love isn't being reciprocated. They're going to be able to do things like set their own boundaries for their partners, and their partners will be able to understand and respect that in response. And we tell you that that's probably just going to lead to far healthier, far better relationships. We are willing to trade off the fact that it might be slightly more draining to participate in a relationship if the relationships on our side of the house are simply infinitely better. For all those reasons, I have never been prouder to propose for the side that stands for relationships, for people, and well, yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, we thank the government whip for that speech. Moving on to the opposition whip.
Oh, hi, checking if I'm visible and audible.
Yes, you are both visible and audible.
All right, so since my rest of my house did this, I'll do this as well. I'd like to give a shout out to my coach Taven K. And oh yeah, new debaters chat plus old guy. Anyone with less than 3 points at SDO has no right to speak. Yeah, okay. Shout outs over. Starting in 3, 2, 1, let's go. If I to make a summary of this government's team's case is that, well, you get better quality relationships and they talk about one-sided relationships. The first observation to make that is that just one-sided relationships are just very rare, and like to begin with, they are like the small minority of relationships. But I think they got the motion wrong. Maybe romantic relationships is one aspect of this motion, but I think on op bench we give you a plethora of other options that could have been explored, such as relationship with the government, relationship with your friends, etc., which they have not really engaged with. They also like to say op whip like to say that like, oh, like you people, like if you didn't lay down your expectations, like that will be the like heartbreak and stuff like that. The first observation made is that people will communicate with like their boyfriends, for example, about their expectations, and they can rant to their friends, and I'll elaborate this later on their like heartfelt like feelings and troubles. I have about 5 clashes for the house today. The first on relationships and partners as a whole, which is the only point where we engage with them with. The second on expectations with parents. The third on women's rights and feminism in general. The fourth on friendship, like explained by my DLO. And lastly on relationships with governments. Okay, so first clash on like just which side gets better relationships and partners in general. What do we get on the Gov bench? Gov bench likes to say that, well, we'll have healthier communication, and we list down the list of expectations. The first response I have for this is that LO explains like that these relationships are toxic in nature. But that's the point, right? When you have a list of expectations breathing you down your neck every day when you meet with your partner, that's when it gets toxic in nature, because you become more insecure, because now that you're faced with an endless checklist of what like burdens to fulfill. Have I gone shopping with you yet? Have I like eaten dinner with you this week yet? We will never know, because this is I said we will never know because the fact of the matter is, on your side of the house, you create an endless list of expectations that individuals have to wire through their head every day, and that's where relationships are worse, because you're not operating on instinct, you're operating on the fact that you have to please someone else, and that's just not how love works. We are not perfect, yes, but I think that there's beauty in imperfection on how your relationships work, because what the comparative on our bench is that maybe there's some expectations. We do believe that there should be expectations, but the fact of the matter is that no one is perfect. The love works in a unique way where I don't even understand because I'm single, but the point is that there's beauty in imperfection, and that's how individuals find love in each other. It's not through transactional expectations, no thank you, but in fact the matter is about finding beauty in imperfection. Is when you find your partner where you're allowed to be the worst form of yourself, because you have to love them at your worst while you give them the best. That's just how relationship work. You cannot be perfect all the time, and when you communicate these unhealthy expectations where there's a checklist of what to do, that's when you lose on your own metric on relationships and love. The second clash I have for the house today is on parents. No thank you. POI and chat. Second clash on parents. The Gov bench tells you that by the own LO or DLO the PM or DPM framing is that you can bring your child up in their own image and and you fulfillment. That the first response to this is that this exists on our side of house, this is not your side of house. But I'll tell you what the flip is on the government bench. In the real government world is where parents breathe heavy expectations down the child necks. Both sides of the house are Singaporean. So we just go out the common narrative that, if I give you food, you have to give me good grades, for instance. This is where you have to fulfill your biological obligations to your parents, i.e. to say that you have to give back something to them because they gave you a home and a shelter, and therefore you need to give them grandbabies. That creates an unhealthy societal nominal expectations, because when you go home every day, you are thinking of possibly how to please your parents in the best possible way, and it affects your daily performances in things like, for example, school, or how you interact with your peers, and your mindset in general is to just please your parents in general. So what do we give you in the op comparative? Their own frame works for us, because the DPM talks about how parents want to bring out child's feel fulfillment from the raising experience, which is exactly the point of parenting. It's not about making the child into your own image, but it was about the satisfaction that you got from the growth and development of the child. It was about seeing the child raised from an infant to a healthy adult, living their own dreams and being proud of their achievements. It's not about expecting them to get good grades and then making you look good in front of your friends on Facebook, for instance, or during Chinese New Year, for instance. Okay, before I move on, point.
Regarding your point about expectations, you do understand that partners still expect realistic things of their other partner. You probably don't expect your partner to be perfect. It probably looks like you expecting them to say thank you. Yeah.
I get a point. The first observation to make is that I think expectations will still exist on our side of the house. Is the fact of the matter is that when you make something transactional, which is what you have to defend, is when the point of which there is a bucket list of expectations. There is a basic expectations that I feel that we believe that everyone should follow. Just don't be a dick wad to your partner, or don't beat them up, for instance, right? It's just basic human sense. The problem is on your side of the house, you list down unhealthy expectations from the start of the relationship that prevent individuals from even accessing the relationship, number one. But I think number two, if they do opt into these relationships, it creates the toxic relationships that you want to talk about. So i.e. to say, now that I have to worry every day on how to please my partner, because I have to fulfill certain checks and balances and requirements in order to fit in this relationship. But that's not how relationship works. Relationship works on instincts, not on a checklist. Okay, next clash on women and feminism. They didn't engage with us on this at all. On the government bench, we explained through my deputy how women historically have to give up things like their jobs, their careers, their education, but more importantly, their bodies to, for example, just conform to societal narratives about marriage, for instance. Think about how in Asia we are raised on the premise that we have to give our parents grandbabies, for instance. On the op comparative, maybe we remove these like transactional relationships because now we give women agency to fulfill their like goals and whatnot. That means to say that maybe they still want to have kids. We are okay with that. But what we are offering them is options. We are offering them an option to either pursue further education, their job, etc., etc. If they want kids, that is perfectly fine. But I just think that when you grow up with expectations breathing down your neck, or your partner telling you that you have kids, it forces you into a structure because of societal norms that you ought to give up your body, you ought to give up your career, you ought to give up like your nights with your friends, for instance, because you have to raise a baby, for instance. This does not cut it. We win on this clash as a whole, and they don't engage with us on that. The next clash on friendship, which was mentioned about my DLO, like on the Gov bench, I guess like when we view ourselves as not being utilitarian in friendship in nature, which is the transaction you that you have to defend, is when you feel really shitty and bad about yourself, right? So like when you don't contribute to your friends as much because you're disabled, for instance, or you couldn't have time to hang out with them. Let's not even talk about disabled people in general. Is when you feel really shitty because you're not there, you don't give them the time and frame and need. But unfortunately, that's how life works because we are really busy people. On the odd bench, the comparative we give you is how like friendships are not built on like the amount of time I hang out with Xiang or Don. Is the amount of time that like the experiences we have, the dinners we share, the jokes that we tell on the table, and that we shouldn't be sharing in this like debate. But the point of the matter is the unique and beautiful thing about friendship is about the time that the experiences that we share together is not the duration of the time, but the quality of time and the jokes that we make along the way. That's how we build like bonds, like brotherhoods and sisterhoods in general. There's no like tangible way to explain this, but it's a unique feeling that we get on our house, and we don't stress about whether I'm hanging out with Don or Chen Xiang enough because I'm like hanging out with Ace and Rihan more. Okay, now moving on to the final clash on governments. I just want to note really quickly that on the government side of house, you force people into abiding the policies like having children, like to get housing, for instance. But on the odd case, we give you agency. I've never been prouder to oppose. 谢谢大家. I call upon op reply.
Okay. We thank the opposition whip for that speech. That concludes the substantive part of this debate. Calling on the opposition reply.
Hi. Can I check that I'm audible and visible again?
Yes, you are still audible and visible.
Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm not sure if anybody on the government team has ever been in a relationship before, but the entire case sounds like a very unrealistic expectation of relationships. The first thing that they say is that you have to communicate everything to your partner. The second thing that they say is that your partner will always understand you because they love you for some reason. But the third thing that they say is that there will never be any one-sided love or toxic relationships if you just communicate with your partner. When Don's girlfriend complains to me that he did not buy her flowers or that he did not spend enough time with her because he was busy gaming, is Don a bad boyfriend? No. Even though his girlfriend told him what he wants and that he doesn't do it, his girlfriend does not have epistemic access to what Don feels. Maybe he was busy, maybe he had something else on his mind. The reason here is that Don is not perfect, but he tries to be a good boyfriend and they do communicate, but problems still arise, which means to say that the harm does not come from not communicating, but rather how tiring it is to communicate afterwards. We are not saying that people don't communicate or that communication is bad. We think that it's perfectly fine for boundaries to be set, and it does happen in status quo, even though this narrative that is not like posited in status quo, right? Like people still communicate and people still act like this because they want something from their partner. It's not true that it doesn't happen on our side. We are saying that communication doesn't make a relationship better and is not an exclusive benefit from this gov team, which means to say that this government team cannot win on the metric of communication, creating a perfect relationship, because it simply does not. The first thing I will do in this motion is in this speech is to talk about how people get into relationships. The first thing that they say on our side is that if you don't communicate, one-sided love is extremely common. Tell me how many people get into a relationship without finding out if the person likes you. But secondly, even if the person, like, they don't explicitly say that they like you, the purpose of a relationship was considered on their side to be long-term, which means to say that the love comes from when you're experiencing it long-term, right? Like, obviously this happens. But two, like if a relationship is one-sided and you are happy, we think it's perfectly fine for you. But three, people are not like that stupid. Like, they know that they want something and if you don't get it back, like obviously they're gonna break up with you. Like that is something that is like in like the quote unquote contract of a relationship. But two, this government team thinks that you can just trauma dump on an individual when you want to love them, right? They say that communication is like the key to having a perfect relationship. No, that's not how relationship works. People want to think that, oh, you tell your girlfriend everything, you must tell me, like you must communicate with me. That doesn't happen because it's tiring and your girlfriend doesn't want to do it, right? Like your girlfriend tells you, buy me flowers, you don't do it. Are you a bad person and you don't love her? No, because one, communication is tiring. Two, communication can be fake, which means to say that if bad actors want to say that I will love you in the future and I will buy you a house of $1 million, this could be fake. Like even if you have realistic expectations like, oh, spend time with me on this weekend, etc., etc., all of these things could be lies. And you don't, like, secondly, you don't fulfill a checklist when you love someone. Like this is just like stupid. This will mean that people go into a relationship saying that, oh, my girlfriend must be pretty, my girlfriend must be smart. All these things don't make a perfect relationship. But lastly, the flip is true. People settle more on their side, which is what I said in my speech. You meet a portion of the checklist and you stay with that person because you're afraid that someone else will never meet the same standard of the checklist. But lastly, they think that people are smart on their side when they're in a relationship. I explained to you that when you're in a relationship, you turn off your brain and you trust your partner extremely much, which means to say that lying exists and bad actors still exist, which means to say that any person who wants to manipulate their partner and want to be toxic toward them, it still exists on their side. It actually is extremely more on their side because they think that because it's transactional and they've already provided something to their partner, it means that they have the right to be like toxic to the person. This flip is extremely important in debate because this explains the harm extremely like more on their side. But the second thing is that what do people do in a relationship? The extent of insecurity is not symmetric. If you have a checklist that you always have to fulfill, the way of paranoia exists more on their side. You concede to this in government whip. But secondly, communication is also not exclusive, which means to say that if you were to always communicate the things that you might be insecure about and that you always have to be pretty for your partner and you always have to be skinny for them to meet their type, it means to say that you always have this expectation on you, and that is bad and that is toxic.
Okay, we thank the opposition replying for that speech to conclude this debate, calling on the government reply.
Yeah, just give me a moment to set up my timer. Apologies. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side opposition claims that the moment people share their boundaries and generate discourse about what they seek in a relationship, that people suddenly become things like ableist and sexist. That it's too hard to share these expectations, and that these expectations is too high. These three claims are completely untrue, and for that reason, they lose this debate. So proud to propose. So 2 questions for the House today. The first question on who gets better emotional security, and the second question on who gets better relationships. I'm going to be first tackling about this issue about relationships, right? Down the bench, understand that we already define transactional relationships as things like compromise, things like communication. We gave substantiation on how it is human nature to want your significant other to respond in kind, right? This comes in things like saying basic things, like saying thanks for giving gifts, understanding and coming to a compromise when things like issues in your day-to-day life clash with your time with your significant other, etc. Understand that these sorts of basic expectations of your significant other is going to be basic, right, and not very difficult to achieve. Or else, if this relationship, if these sort of expectations are unrealistic, for instance, your body shape, the fact that your significant other is forcing you to become a housewife, then like your relationship won't occur in the first place, right? So therefore, also understand that relationships, again, they are symbiotic, right? When you sort of enter a social contract and expect something, this isn't necessarily selfish. You are just doing things like ensuring that you prioritize things like your mental health, your happiness, and sort of the legitimacy of care given by your partner, i.e. sort of your conditions and expectations of your significant other will be present even if unconsciously. So we can concede that expectations will be a thing, but this isn't inherently bad, right? So the only response that opposition gives to this claim is that, when you have a checklist, you have more paranoia and dissent towards your partner, and communication is tiring. Again, if you're going to be paranoid and hold dissent, then you probably have these individuals that won't have partners in status quo. Furthermore, the sort of the compromise and discussion on capabilities of your significant other vis-a-vis your desire or wants will still be present. Insofar as a relationship is one that is meaningful and not superficial, probably priority will be given to these sorts of discussion, these sorts of actions, right? And understand also then that the level we expect of others is proportional, right? I.e. equivalent exchange, right? So things like your ableist behavior won't exist, things like your sexist behavior won't exist, etc. So ops paradigm, you probably get more things like covert and unnoticed toxic relationships. You probably get things like more negligent actors. So therefore, we think that insofar as you get less toxic relationships, you get more genuine, organic, and happy individuals on our side of the house. We already take this clash, we already take this debate. But then on to the second clash on who gets better emotional security, right? Here, we tell you that when you express your desires and come to a compromise about entering your relationships, you feel more safe and secure. It's like opposition says that, oh, people generally aren't a dick. People generally don't act like assholes. A, understand that being a dick and being an asshole is subjective because the trigger point for each individual is different. And B, even if this weren't true, that everyone has the same expectations or has the same trigger point for being a dick or being an asshole, individuals exist on a spectrum, relationships are intimate and informal, so therefore probably you will have individuals being a dick or being assholes in your world. Right. So then they come and talk to us about this idea, oh, you should allow yourself to be the worst form of yourself, and the checklist denies this because you set expectations for yourself. Okay, again, we see that you can be imperfect, right? And the checklist will be realistic. The checklist will have basic things like, responding to your partner in kind, not ignoring or not neglecting your partner, not going to your significant other only to feel better about yourself. And again, if these people are so paranoid and so insecure, they won't enter relationships in the first place. So then onto the last 2 points about feminism and parenting, right? The feminism point, again, it doesn't make sense. We're not living in the 1800s. Things like sexism, hate crimes, forcing your significant other to get pregnant is probably going to be held accountable in the courts, whether it be the public opinion or the official courts. This point doesn't make sense, right? Okay, and also the last point on parenting, that this isn't mutually exclusive. The sort of what you get in the transaction is this sort of sense of fulfillment, and so therefore we see that we can also co-opt the benefits of having parental relationships. As such, please side opposition, the side that cares for discourse, genuine relationships, and emotional security.
Okay, we think the government reply for that speech. We think both teams forward us a wonderful debate. Please cross the house.